Good evening. I'm Robert Lawrence, Albert Williams Professor of International Trade here at the Kennedy School. And it's a pleasure for me to welcome you here this evening to this ARCO Forum event at the Institute of Politics. The world economy today is clearly in a critical condition. The events of September the 11th came just as we were on the verge of a first synchronized global slowdown for about 2 decades. The American economy was already adjusting to the bursting of a stock market bubble and a major decline in high-tech investment. The Japanese economy was already in another deflationary downturn, and throughout Europe, the prospects for growth were rapidly eroding. Several developing countries, particularly Argentina and Turkey, were flirting with major defaults. Now all of these developments seem to have shown signs of even further deterioration. Recently, we learned yet again of another decline in U.S. consumer confidence, and our colleagues at the National Bureau have said that the U.S. is officially in recession. Several European economies appear set to follow. This week, the German government reduced its growth forecast for next year. Only yesterday, the Japanese sovereign debt was downgraded by Standard & Poor's, who warned that the banks in Japan are looking even shakier. And today, Financial Times reports that Argentina has fallen short of the budget targets that it had agreed to as a condition for IMF support, and that it could be on the verge of a massive default. Today, therefore, the battle for recovery must take place at the same time as the war against terror. How should these battles be waged? What role should be played by a fiscal stimulus package in the United States? What contributions can be made by policies abroad? Is there a need, as has recently been suggested by Anne Kruger, the Deputy Director of the International Monetary Fund, for a dramatically new approach to the creditors of developing countries who are when they're effectively bankrupt? Can the battle against the funds financing terror be effective? I think these are the key economic questions of the day, and there are few who are more qualified to speak on these issues than John Taylor, who's on the front line of these battles daily as the current Undersecretary for International Affairs at the Department of the Treasury. John is not new to the world of policy. He served both as a staff economist and as a member of the Council of Economic Advisors, and he's been a member of California's Council of Economic Advisors. John's also one of our nation's most distinguished macroeconomists. Before joining the administration, he was the Roberts Professor of Economics at Stanford University, and he's particularly well known for his contributions to our understanding of the behavior of economies that have long-term wage contracts. He's also the author of the Taylor Rule, that explains short-term interest rate changes on the basis of the monetary authority's reactions to inflation and output growth. In fact, only recently we had a conference in which one author claimed that a Taylor Rule could have done about as well as Alan Greenspan in operating monetary policy over the past decade. John's also renowned on the Stanford campus as an outstanding teacher of economics. It's said that he'll resort to any trick he can to make economics more understandable for his students. His topic this evening will be strengthening the global economy after September 11th, the Bush administration's agenda. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the current Undersecretary of the Treasury, the Honorable John B. Taylor.
Thanks very much for the introduction, and I must say it's good to be back at a university and seeing students and faculty. Again, I went to Washington in the spring of this year after the Bush administration began from Stanford University, where I'm very interested in interacting with students and faculty, so it's kind of good to be back at a university. So thanks for inviting me and having me. I wanted to talk about some of the things we're doing on international economic policy in the Bush administration. And to get into that, I want to relate a lot to how the September 11th events have affected us in policy making. And one way I thought about just getting us all thinking about that is just to reflect on the fact that we all can remember exactly what we were doing when we first heard the news about the jets crashing into the World Trade Center. I remember it very well. I was in the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo. I was preparing with some of our Treasury financial attachés for a meeting with the Japanese to consider some of the agenda we were going to be discussing. I was part of a delegation chaired by Secretary O'Neill, Secretary of the Treasury. We were engaged in a trip that was we'd just been in Beijing, and Suzhou met with Jiang Zemin and other economic leaders, thinking about what our foreign policy in the economic area should be looking like. And on September 12th, we were to meet with the Japanese to consider this. Well, needless to say, we didn't meet with the Japanese on September 12th. Instead, we got in a C-17 military transport jet, just us in the plane and the pilots, basically, Secret Service, and flew back to Washington, aerial refueling over Alaska. And the whole way back to America, we were thinking, how is this going to affect what we're doing? And we could already see that it was going to be a big change in what we thought was an already very big economic agenda. And when we got back from Washington, it's just basically been nonstop ever since, doing things that, as I think I'll explain in a few minutes, I never expected that I would be doing. What I'd like to do to talk about the international economic agenda is talk about a couple of the goals that I think we have and should have in considering the agenda. Talk a little bit how it interacts with the foreign policy part of what we're doing, because that helps explain how things changed on the economic front on September 11th. And then go through some of the action plans that fit into this framework with more or less in terms of examples, and I think that'll give you a good picture of the agenda that we're pursuing. I always think of there's two goals of economic policy, international economic policy in general. One is to have a high rate of growth, productivity growth, income per capita growing in the United States and for international economic policy, other countries around the world. Goal number two is to try to have as much economic stability as is possible. Fewer crises, infrequent recessions, long expansions, modest downturns, a great degree of cyclical stability, if you like. Those two goals in international framework apply not to just the United States, but to other countries. They're simple, but I think if you think through every policy you go through, if you can deliver on those two goals and focus on those two goals, you can accomplish a lot. Those two goals didn't change on September 11th, but they expanded in ways that I'll just describe in a minute. They didn't change in the sense that President Bush has continued to think that what each country needs to do to keep economic growth strong around the world is to do good economic policy in the context of that country. And I think that's continued to be the philosophy, is to work with countries, exchange information, but basically to encourage in various ways good economic policy that encourages those two goals. He's also maintained his strong interest in free trade. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, but there's no change whatsoever in that goal, which of course is at its heart a way to increase economic growth in the whole world economy. To understand how things changed, I think I'd like to describe how economic policy fits in to foreign policy in this administration, because that fits in a quite intricate, interesting way. In the first national security presidential directive of President Bush, NSPD-1 we called it, he designated the Secretary of the Treasury as a member, permanent member if you like, of the Principals Committee at the National Security Council. So that means the Secretary of the Treasury would normally, at principals meetings, cabinet meetings of the National Security Council, cabinet level meetings, be sitting next to the Secretary of State and to the Secretary of Defense. And what that symbolizes is an integration of military, political, and economic concepts and ideas in the foreign policy in the United States. I think what that has done is elevate economic issues in the foreign policy area, which has, I think, been constructive. I think it would be constructive even if I weren't an economist. But it also has led to interesting synergies between the political and the military and the economic. One little synergy I always like to point out is we seem to be using action plans and input-output and checklists, sort of business-like economic things on foreign policy issues which are not that easy to quantify. So there's an interesting interaction between these economic issues and the political and military. And one area which I'll come back to, again, is in the case of our economic relations, our overall relations with Russia, in a so-called new strategic framework, which is built on these three building blocks. So given that that is the framework of foreign policy with these three aspects integrated, it's not surprising that there was going to be a change in the international economic policy as a result of 9/11. Number one, when President Bush gave that remarkable speech, the joint session of Congress with Tony Blair in the gallery, saying that this is a war on terrorism, that basically meant that we're going to have to take some shots. And what is the first shot that he actually took? The way he puts it, the first shot I took was on September 24th, when it was on the financing of terrorism, when he lists the financial assets of terrorists in the United States, lists their names, and then asked our banks and financial institutions to block those accounts in the United States. There's a quick interaction between the foreign policy, in this case, military, political, and the economic. Second thing that he did with respect to this effort was to say that any country which was facilitating terrorism was one of our enemies. And so that also began to affect what we were doing in this financial aspects of the war on terrorism, because what we had to do is to communicate, if you like, financial diplomacy with other countries in the world to join us in this blocking of the financial assets of terrorists. And finally, I'll try to mention a little bit about how the action after the military action is over or develops in different ways in Afghanistan, how important it's going to be to have a solid economic foundation for growth in that country. So I think those are kind of examples of how this close interaction of economics and other aspects of foreign policy changed the international economic agenda in fundamental ways. What I'd like to do is just quickly kind of run down in a sort of a tick-by-tick Sesame Street style examples of how these things apply. First thing, in terms of the specific policies that I think is important in terms of international economic policy, is to get the policy right at home. I always say you get 90% of the job of a good international economic policy is to have policies right in each country. So when you look at our international economic policy before 9/11, after 9/11, you say, what have we done in the United States with respect to policy? Well, as you know, and as Professor Lawrence indicated in his introduction, the U.S. economy has been slowing down since the middle of last year. Economic growth was over 4% to the middle of last year, and then in the third quarter of last year sunk to 1.3, and in the 4 quarters after that was only 1.2% growth. So we've had this slowdown even before 9/11, and the policy response to that has been swift, both on the monetary policy and the fiscal policy front. It seems to me remarkably swift. The Federal Reserve cut interest rates by 300 basis points early part of this year. There was a tax cut which was ready to go after the campaign, which was passed remarkably quickly, timely with respect to dealing with a slowdown. And of course, you had the automatic stabilizers working as the economy slowed down. The surplus began to go down, which provided stimulus to the economy. Things were looking reasonably good on September 11th, which was another hit to the economy. And this has deepened and drawn out the slump that we were in before 9/11. But again, I think the response in the United States has been remarkably fast. On the monetary policy front, the Federal Reserve, in the days after September 11th, provided a remarkable degree of increase in liquidity. Open market purchases, a liberal loan policy to banks, the amount of deposits or reserves increased by a huge amount, provided it offset some of the decline in activity that otherwise would have occurred. And since then, the liquidity has been drawn out, but the Federal Reserve has cut interest rates again, now only 2%, the lowest in 40 years. And the fiscal policy front, the automatic stabilizers are continuing to work. Plus, we're trying to get a stimulus package passed, and I'm very optimistic we will before the Congress goes into the holiday recess. So that seems to me like a lot of pretty good things moving quickly with respect to the first component of our international economic policy, which is the policy at home. Now, what about when you take this to other countries? How does that work? Well, one area where the United States can cooperate in its international economic policy is in the so-called G7, the 7 largest industrial countries in the world. That's a meeting that takes place occasionally, sometimes regularly. Well, what happened after September 11th is we called together a special meeting of this G7. It was on October 6th, and basically thought through what would be the way that we could coordinate or cooperate on policy in the various countries. And what the finance ministers and central bank governors of these 7 largest countries decided, in a way, makes a lot of sense, and that is that each country would take policy actions to increase growth consistent with what was going on in each country. The United States part of that was what I just described. Europeans tried to find a way to not only ease monetary policy, but to accelerate some tax cuts that were already in the pipeline. The Japanese, completely different situation, wouldn't want to call for the same kind of action as in the United States, already has a large deficit. What they decided to do was talk about dealing with their non-performing loan problems and focus on monetary policy. So it seems to me what kind of coordination you're having in this case is each country doing what it needs to do in its own circumstances to deal with the problem, and that's exactly the kind of philosophy I indicated President Bush would have in his overall economic policy. I found that this coordination process had an enormous amount of spillover which didn't exist before September 11th. And that spillover had to do with this combating the financing of terrorism. The G7 does not include Russia. There's a G8 concept which includes Russia. At this meeting of the G7, it was the first time that the Russian finance minister participated in things other than just what's happening with the Russian economy. And they participated in trying to combat the financing of terrorism and showing how they could go about doing that. So it's I guess a degree of cooperation and coordination on international economic policy that we probably wouldn't have seen otherwise. The third thing I'd like to mention as an example is economic growth in the developing world. It's a very high priority in our international economic policy. Economic growth is essential if we're going to avoid the kind of problems that we've seen with respect to having hotbeds of terrorism in countries like Afghanistan, but it's important on its own right to have better growth around the world. One way we're focusing on that is by trying to reform the actions and the work of the multilateral development banks, such as the World Bank. And the strategy here is to develop a theme. The themes are not much different than the 2 goals I mentioned at the beginning, stressing economic growth, productivity growth, and then finding ways that the multilateral development banks that have responsibility for improving economic development can take action. So that's actually, I think, been working well. A specific part of that overall reform effort in the multilateral development banks is a proposal that President Bush has made to call for an increase in the amount of grants that the World Bank makes to develop to the very poorest countries, the countries who have high debt levels already. So what the United States is proposing under the President's leadership is that the grants, that the assistance to the poorest countries not be in the form of loans, but in the form of outright grants, and therefore trying to deal both with the debt problem, but also dealing with the development problem directly. That's an item which we need to do a lot of negotiating with other countries, because many are not on board with the President's proposal yet, so we need to be working on that. We'll be doing that in the next couple of weeks. A fourth area, and this is, we're going through this quickly, so maybe we can go back over it in the Q&A. A fourth area, which is very important, it's closer to that second goal of economic stability, is to get a greater degree of stability in the emerging markets. Emerging market debt markets, emerging markets in government debt have been subject to a lot of crises in recent years. Risk premia are high in many countries. More importantly, the flows that are coming from the developed countries to the developing countries are down substantially since the late 90s. And so we really need to take some action to deal with that instability. And I would say that is a goal here, an important part of our international economic policy, is to try to improve the stability and to have more private capital flows going to these countries. The first strategy here is to try to prevent crises. So we're spending more time on analyzing the source of crises. We're asking the IMF to spend more time on crisis prevention, to focus their work more on crises and less on other things that may be less central to their responsibility, so that we can reduce the amount of crises there are. We're also emphasizing that the official sector, including the IMF, really can't be on the line all the time in a world where we want these markets to grow. To put it this way, if economic development is going to move ahead to reduce poverty around the world, emerging markets are going to have to be bigger and bigger. And so to provide greater stability to those markets, the official sector, if you like, the developed countries can't provide as much as they grow larger and larger. So we need to be ready to find ways to provide assistance with less official support compared to the total. In addition, there's been a lot of concern that the official support had gotten too big in the past in certain cases and had really been in the business of bailing out private bondholders, and that's another reason to try to draw back on the amount of that official support. So that's a strategy which we're working on with our colleagues in the other countries and with the IMF. And we're not there yet, but as Professor Lawrence indicated, there's interest now as we move down the road is to try to find some new ways to resolve crises in ways which are not disruptive to the financial markets. And that's this idea of some kind of international insolvency mechanism, whereby if a country chooses to restructure its debt, it can do so in a more organized way, a way that the markets can understand and plan for. So this is an idea that's been being discussed, and I think it will be discussed in the future. The official sector doesn't want to encourage any country to default. There are occasionally restructurings, and any restructuring that occurs you want to have in the smoothest way possible. So that's the kind of thing that we are working towards. And I think it's promising. Right now, in the crises that we do see, as Professor Lawrence indicated, a restructuring is going on in Argentina. We're seeing less contagion to other countries than we've seen in the past. In fact, more generally speaking, without even mentioning any particular country, there's been a remarkable drop in the amount of contagion from one event to another in these emerging markets. And I think that's because the markets themselves, the people in the markets, the participants in the markets are paying more attention to the fundamentals. And what we're trying to do in the official sector, in the U.S. government, for example, is reflect on that fact and build on it by saying we also are paying more attention to the fundamentals and are basing our decisions not on something that could be just automatic contagion or just might happen for no reason related to fundamentals, but that we're always going to be looking at fundamentals as well. And I think that's partly one of the reasons why contagion has declined as well. I've promised to stop, and I've not got through all of my little things, but I want to just say very quickly, free trade, an important part of our agenda. Bilateral relationships with things like Russia, an important part of our agenda. Trying to reconstruct countries like Afghanistan, an important part of our agenda. And I'd like to answer any questions you have about those, but I think what I'm trying to do here and what the idea is to put those out as examples of an overall framework that builds on the two goals of strong economic growth and greater economic stability, recognizing that economics is just one part of our overall foreign policy. So I'll stop there as instructed and see what kind of question you might have. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Economics likes to pride itself on maximizing subject to a constraint, and John, you stuck to the time constraint admirably. I hope that our questioners will do the same, that what you'll do is please identify yourself and then ask a brief question rather than making a statement. And we'll just basically alternate with the two microphones that are down here. If you'd like to ask a question, please join the line. Let's start off.
Hi, my name is Michael Baumgartner. I study international development here at the Kennedy School. My question is, what do you think the prospects are of, in the next round of trade negotiations, of the U.S. market for their opening to agricultural goods from developing countries, specifically Africa? And I was very much hoping that this administration would be pro-trade, and the initial signals from the steel protection and the pending farm bill subsidies don't seem to be moving really that way.
Well, I very much hope that we make a lot of progress in this round in agriculture. It's going to be very important for developing countries and very important for U.S. agricultural producers. So it's a very high priority in the round. And by the way, just to provide some background, a very important event occurred a couple weeks ago in Doha, where we actually initiated a new multilateral trade round to reduce trade barriers in all countries around the world. So it's very promising. To make that happen, we need to have trade promotion authority in the United States so that we can negotiate these agreements. But I'm very optimistic about this round. I think it's going to be good for economic growth, and we are very much interested in free trade. You ask about steel. Right now, there's an effort underway which I think is very promising to reduce the amount of overall protectionist pressure that we've seen in the steel markets for many, many, many years. Experts like Professor Lawrence knows that, 30 years at least. And so what we're trying to do is to globally reduce the amount of subsidies that countries provide to steel producers around the world, and also through that mechanism reduce the amount of total steel capacity in the world. Otherwise, this problem is going to continue to interfere and be problematic for administration after administration. So I actually am pretty optimistic about what's happening on the steel front. And on the agricultural front, let's get into those trade negotiations and get the trade barriers down in every country. I think it'd be beneficial.
Secretary Taylor, Dal Lamagna, I'm a mid-career student. I'm also a businessman. You talk about one of the goals being stability, and for the world market, as a business person who deals in the world market, I would love to see stability in the financial currency rates, the exchange rates, the yen versus the dollar, the euro versus the dollar. Personally, it's driven me crazy because it goes up, goes down, and I'm thinking about foreign currency all the time instead of my product. Is there something, I've heard of a Tobin tax, or maybe the other thing I noticed is that the margin requirement to hold the foreign currency position is so low, like 1.5%, 2%, that allows people like George Soros to go against the Bank of England. Is there something that the administration is thinking about doing to calm down the unnatural movements of foreign currency markets?
Well, I'll say two things. Tobin tax is not going to be something that's going to calm currency markets, and I don't think it's a good idea. It's a tax on transactions, and it's for some reason or another become popular as almost in people that are against trade. There's a symbolism, I think, that it interferes with trade, or sand in the wheels is sometimes the way it's put, but I think it would be a bad idea. Moreover, I think to the extent it becomes a rallying cry for people who would like to close markets, I don't think it's effective. I think in terms of the increase in stability, the example I gave about emerging markets is, I would still say it's very important. Those are areas where there's extraordinarily high risk premium, and they fluctuate around a lot. And I think there's been some improvement in the threats of sharp movements of exchange rates over the years, as more countries have chosen to have more or less floating exchange rates. So while 2 or 3 years ago, especially in the crises in Asia, very sharp, very quick, and therefore disturbing movements of exchange rates, they have been less of a problem since we've moved in more countries to floating exchange rates. So I think that's something that we've been supportive of. Other countries, if they'd like to move to floating exchange rates, they should do that.
What about raising margin requirements from 1% to 10%? Is that a consideration?
No.
Okay.
Hello, my name is Tom Bishop, and I have a question about the rebuilding of Afghanistan. You mentioned that briefly in your speech, and
Yes.
it seems like it's strategically very important to the stability of the whole region, but yet the costs will be incredibly staggering. I've heard estimates as much as $10 billion just to rebuild the road system. So my question is there any figure that's being floated within the administration about how much that will cost us as an American government, and how much support is there within the Bush administration to actually providing support to reconstruct Afghanistan?
This is something we've been working on for a long time, roughly since the bombs started dropping in Afghanistan, to indicate how important we think it is. And it will take a lot of financial support, but it's also going to take a lot of ingenuity and know-how. This is a country which has very low income per capita, extraordinarily low literacy rates, a lot of poverty. So it's going to be, and their infrastructure is in bad shape. So it requires a lot of demining. So there is going to be an effort to do that. In a way, there's a capacity about how much can actually be done in a short period of time. But I'd say two things. One is you have to take a long-term perspective. It's not going to be 1 year, 2 years. Think about 10 years it's going to be taking to move this into a more satisfactory situation. And it is going to take money. But what I think is very promising is the extent to which the international community is already stepping up to try to help out in this. We had a very successful meeting in Washington the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, where 20 countries came to begin to get the estimates, the needs assessment on not just but humanitarian and reconstruction. And there's going to be a follow-up meeting on that in Brussels next week, and then a meeting in Japan at the end of January, where we'll really be getting specific pledges about contributions. And it's very important, but it's really a real rewarding thing to see how many countries are already interested in participating.
But do you think that there's appetite within the administration to kind of pay their bill, so to speak?
Well, the United States is very active in this war on terrorism, and it's very active in trying to provide a more secure foundation in the future so there aren't these hotbeds of terrorism. So I would say what we're going to do is do what's necessary, but it's going to be a multilateral effort with many countries participating, and we will be there participating. And the good news is lots of interest right now.
Thanks. Please.
Good evening, Secretary of State. My name is Dalmasio Benicio. I'm a student of international development here. My question is related to President Bush's plan to have the World Bank providing greater grant to poorer countries. Now, Europeans have expressed some concern over that plan, that may bankrupt the bank. Would the Bush administration commit itself to providing more money to the World Bank so they can carry on this plan?
There is no way that this kind of plan could bankrupt any organization. Right now, the loans that are given are very concessional. They're 40-year loans, and there's a 10-year grace period, and the interest rate is 0.75%. And so it's those loans to the various poorest country which the President has argued should be just in the form of grants. If it's so grant-like, that just make it a grant and not get into this effort of making loans. And moreover, that will mean the countries, the very poor countries who have to pay interest on the debt they already have, will have grants rather than more debt. So it's very much something that is in the interest of the poorest countries and the people in those countries. But the reason why it's not a problem with respect to financing is that the loans are already so concessional. It's really going to be 10 or 20 years before you see any noticeable impact on the flows. And what I would say, the numbers are like 4 or 5% compared to the total amount of spending. It's very small. But what I would say is if we can be more convincing about how these things are effective in actually helping people, and we would like the grants and other aid to be performance-based. So if it's successful in increasing education or enrollment or reducing the incidence of HIV/AIDS, whatever it happens to be, we want to make sure that occurs. And I think people in America are generous, and when they see that this is effective, they'll be willing to do more. And so I'm optimistic that this strategy is part of making the World Bank more effective and people are going to see it's more effective, and they're going to like that and be more positive about contributing.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Josh Weiner. I'm a junior at the college. You touched on this at the beginning, but it hasn't been so long since we were discussing issues that were more like Japan, China, the Euro, rather than Afghanistan. And I certainly, nobody in this room, I'm sure, has any doubt why we're discussing Afghanistan so much. But the other issues are still there. In fact, they've probably gotten worse because of what's happened with Afghanistan. My question to you is, at what point do you think Treasury, at least, will be able to concentrate on some of those other issues more than they have? At what point do you think the Afghanistan issues, responding to terrorism directly, will be able to get on the back burner and let the other issues that are very important be able to come through again?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And first thing I want to say is that when we started this effort in the war against terrorism, the president was very explicit everywhere in the government about don't forget the other things you've been doing before. And so it's just a reminder. And also when you have to find a way to delegate and find ways to move resources around to be more effective and increase resources. So I don't want to say there's a free lunch here, but really are paying attention to Japan and to China and those other relationships as we're doing these other things. So it's not being neglected. In terms of the time, President has emphasized how this war on terrorism is a long-term effort. And as I said, Afghanistan, with respect to reconstruction, is going to be a long-term thing. I think it's important to have that attitude now so that we stay the course or stay at it. And I think that this is going to be something which we'll be facing a long time. I have a son who's in college, and we talk about how maybe it's your generation's job here to really win this war. It's going to be a long-term effort. So think about ways you can do that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Secretary Taylor, I'm Yi-Bing Mu, Amazing Fellow of KSG. In your speech, you briefly mentioned the top priority of development banks should help developing countries improve productivity. Could you elaborate a bit more? I mean, do you mean this means the mission of development bank should focus on help developing country improve institution capacity, or health, or education, or the combination of both? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The concept here is to focus more on the reasons why some people in some countries are well off and some are poor. And that reason, based on research and experience and history, is that there's a difference in their productivity, difference in the productivity of the individuals in the country. When I teach Economics 1, the principles course at Stanford, I have a map of the world, and it's different colors. It's the same kind of map that used to illustrate poverty and different levels of income. But that map shows productivity. And there's countries that have low productivity or poor. Countries that have high productivity are rich. And so what we want to do is focus more on that idea of productivity, the amount that each worker can produce. It's not a new idea, but the idea is to try to have more focus on that fundamental thing. And how does productivity increase? Well, we have lots of evidence on that too, and you mentioned two of them: education, so people get more skills, and health, so they can be at the job more and learn as well. So those are the two components that will increase productivity. But the private sector is a very important part of that. If you look at productivity accelerations in the United States or differences between countries, you see the private sector taking new ideas and putting them into place. So it also places a greater degree of emphasis on the private sector. So it's a theme, but a theme, of course, is not enough. You have to implement it with things that will raise productivity, whether it happens to be with a school or with a pharmaceutical program or whatever.
Good evening. My name is Khương Vu. I am a PhD student in public policy. You twice emphasize the importance of bilateral trade with Russia. And I wonder what the motive behind this new policy because of Russia, because of the new level of relationship between the two countries, or because of Russia become a very credible alternative source of oil, crude oil, when the country facing some high risk of dealing with Arab countries, or because of the recent spectacular growth, economic growth in Russia in the last 2 years. So.
Well, the U.S. Relationship with Russia, the new strategic framework that President Bush has emphasized, I think is really working well. It involves, as I said, political, military, and economic issues. The economic issues have been focused on more microeconomic things, business sector, loans to startup firms and things like that in Russia, and also trying to get Russia into the WTO, facilitate that operation to work with our Commerce Department so Russia is considered a market economy. Those are all things that on the economic front that I think are very promising. But they're related to strategic issues on the missile defense and on weapons in general. And I think most important, see how important that new relationship has been as we've started this war on terrorism. The cooperation with Russia in the area I deal with, I can't speak for every area, that is combating the financing of terrorism, these blocking orders which we put has been really remarkably good, considering where you might have thought things would have been in January or even in the spring of this year, as I say, sitting at the table discussing these with the other G7 partners. So I actually think it's a real bright aspect of our foreign policy generally, but also, since I'm speaking here about the international economic side, the economic side as well.
Mr. Undersecretary, my name is Emilio Lozoya. I'm an international development student here at the Kennedy School. I would like you to comment a bit more on the agenda that the U.S. delegation was going to address in Japan, and if the Bush administration has given any specific recommendations to the Japanese government in order to get their economy out of the recession.
Yeah, that's a good question. We have been working with Japan. President Bush has met with Prime Minister Koizumi. It was a good relationship. Economics is part of their discussions. We've had lots of discussions with them about their policy, what they need to do to increase growth. And I think there's a couple of things that they have focused on, and we have been positive about. In other words, applauding what they're doing and helping in whatever way we can. But I would just mention two. One is the effort to deal with the non-performing loan problems in their banks, to get those off the bank's balance sheets and have the collateral that underlies those, the assets that underlies those, whether they're a vacant lot or a shopping center or a firm, into the marketplace so that they can be more productive and the banks can make more loans. It seems very important, and the Koizumi government has stressed that, and it's difficult politically for them to do, but they're working it through the system, and that's something that seems positive. Then the other thing is on the monetary policy front. In March, the Bank of Japan indicated that it would like to have inflation greater than or equal to zero. It has been less than zero, deflation. And to accomplish that, they would focus more on quantities rather than interest rates. Interest rate being close to zero becomes less effective as an instrument. And they've been pursuing that as well, and we've been positive about that. But it's going to take a while, and we are working with them closely. And at this point in time, though, that's our policy. It's not a matter of trying to be domineering or anything else than just a partner and a friend giving friendly advice both ways.
Secretary Taylor, my name is John. I'm a student in the graduate program of Art and Sciences. You mentioned in your talk that a significant part of international policy is the stabilization policy at home, and one market aspect of that is the retroactive corporate tax rebate to corporations for 15 years. Leaving aside how the cost of external finance have come down in the last 2-3 months, it seems like a lot of the corporations that this money is going to have a significant amount of cash on hand. And even to the extent that there are firms that are credit constrained, wouldn't such a tax cut be better focused towards those particular firms? So I'm just wondering if you could comment on the Bush administration's rationale for this type of policy.
Yeah, I think it's generally a bad idea to try to focus tax policy on particular kinds of firms. Maybe that's not what you're referring to, but I think the notion of things being across the board or even-handed is something that the Bush administration, we've tried to stress in our tax policy. So, for example, the tax cut which was passed in the summer had really an across-the-board reduction in personal income tax rates. In that package, there was nothing on the business side, and a lot of people wondered about that and suggested, well, maybe the next time there's a need for a tax cut, you can focus more on the business side rather than just on the personal side. And I think that's what you're seeing here. In addition, investment is an important way to get the economy moving, and so there is some focus on investment as well. But I think basically the stimulus package is the most important thing now is to get it passed. And I think nothing is more important with respect to the package now than passing it rather than to try to pull various things out and trying to change it.
And I guess I would just ask, why not focus more on lowering the marginal tax rate for these firms rather than the lump sum transfers?
Well, I would just say I think marginal tax rates are important to focus on, and in most parts of the tax policy we have, it's the reducing marginal tax rates, the personal side, and the part that has to do with the investment incentives is effectively a marginal tax rate. But if that's what you're asking, yeah, amen. We should focus on keeping marginal tax rates as low as we can. Yeah.
Thanks. We have time for 2 more questions, so let's just take them in alternate. Thanks.
Okay. Hello, my name is Romina Bandura. I am an international development student here at the Kennedy, and I'm from Argentina. And I wanted to ask you, what's your personal opinion on the solution to the Argentine crisis?
Well, I think the President de la Rua, the plan he released several weeks ago is a very important step in resolving the crisis that has been facing Argentina. And the economics minister, Cavallo, is working that plan through now operationally. And that has to do with the debt exchange, and there's also a strong commitment to the convertibility law, as well as trying to reduce the fiscal deficit, to keep the deficit at zero. So all those things are in place, and I think it's good, and they're working on it, and I hope it's effective. But I can't be anything but positive about the plan and the ideas at this point, because I think they've taken some good steps. They've indicated to the community, the financial community, why it's a good idea, and they're operating on it now. Okay.
Secretary Taylor, I'm an MPA graduate of the Kennedy School in 1992. I also serve as the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee in Minnesota, in the Minnesota House. And we're facing, and we'll next week get a forecast, and I'm expecting a multi-billion-dollar impact on our state economy. And the plane flying out today, I read about Northwest Airlines laying off or furloughing over 400 pilots. My own community, IBM, is again in its 3rd layoff of people at that company. That's the background for my question. I see quite a conflict in global economy efforts that you described, giving grants instead of loans, and I think that's very wise because our experience in collecting those loans has been problematic. But it seems to me a conflict with trying to strengthen our own economy when we're heading into the morning paper said expect at least 3 more years of deficits on a federal level. How do you expect, aren't you in a situation on one side of the Treasury in conflict with someone on the other side of the Treasury or in the Congress on saying which comes first, strengthening our own economy or going farther into a deficit situations to try to improve the world economy?
That's an excellent question. The first point in my list of things we were doing on our international economic agenda was what we were doing at home, what we were doing for the American economy.
Productivity.
Stimulus packages, tax cuts, Federal Reserve easing. There's also efforts to keep the airlines running early on after 9/11. So I meant it when I said the first thing on a good international economic policy is in a policy that keeps, in our case, America strong. And I really believe that. That's what we should be doing, and I think we are trying to do that. There's been a lot of stimulus that's been provided on the federal side. The decline in the surplus, economists consider as a measure of stimulus. It's changed by 2 percentage points in the last year. And I know the state's situation, and it's many states, of course. The state where I come from, California, is getting the same experience right now. And I think that's why it's important to try to keep this slump or this downturn as short as possible. And I think I can be optimistic. It looks like things are turning around, and we'll be getting growth in the early part of next year again. So anyway, I think it's a good question, and I hope I've indicated how important it is in my answer. Okay.
Yes, you gave me priorities.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you very much. I mentioned earlier that as a professor, John Taylor would do anything to try to explain things to his students. I'm told that in order to explain the concept of externalities, he actually would hire a rock band to play very loudly outside the class, and then invite the students to auction and to see how much they would pay in order to get the band to stop. I don't want to have an auction tonight to ask the students here whether we should continue, because I'm sure we would continue for a long time. So I'll simply end and thank you for a superb presentation.
Okay.